The 1800s were a very important time of change, both for the town and for First Parish. Sam Doran, tell us what was going on in Lexington. What was it like in the 1800s?
Well, the main event of that century was, of course, the coming of the railroad. And that was in 1846 that really connected Lexington with West Cambridge, then the name of Arlington, through to Cambridge and Boston. And that resulted in a lot of wealthy Bostonians coming out here for their summer homes or perhaps commuting into their offices. And that really changed the dynamic of the town in some respects, as it was no longer strictly an agricultural community as it had been since its founding. The 1800s also saw the rise of dairy farms in Lexington, and that became a major staple of our local economy for the next 100 years or so.
There'd been a lot of cows here earlier, and this was a dairy community to a degree in earlier times, right?
Right, although I suppose the main difference was now that there were milk trains going into Boston and a much larger market with the hotels and so forth in the city.
Suzanne, was there significant changes? And you've told us about the music in the 1600s and the 1700s. Was there a significant change in music and church during the 1800s?
Yes, there would have been a lot more participation by other people other than professional musicians in the church. There probably would have been a choir. There would have been instruments playing in the churches by then. In fact, at First Parish, the first organ was put in the 1840s. So the fact that they are having an organ in the church, that tells us a lot about what led up to that. Instruments being allowed to play, choirs singing rather than the congregation. They were also using hymns by that time rather than strictly psalm singing. And we have a book here that it's called a psaltery. It's labeled a psaltery, but it has more than psalms in it. It has anthems, choir anthems, and it has chants for use in the church and tunes to use with the new hymns that were being written. So we have all these things here, choir books rather than congregational books. All of these that I have in my lap are anthem books that would have been used by a choir. That's the main difference that would have happened during the 19th century.
Was the composers, were they different? And was there...
Yes, they would have been listening to music, popular music, rather than sacred, of course, but still music that would have been commercial.
So rap and...
Exactly. The rap of their days would have been the music of Handel and Bach, which were of a previous generation, but they would have been listened to in church and performed in church as part of the ritual, part of the worship service.
And of course, much of that century, that music would have been performed in this very sanctuary in which we sit, because this church was constructed, this church building, 1847, as we'll find out. And Peter, what kind of a service would I be involved in listening to during this period?
In the 19th century, the service developed in ways that were quite different from the earlier ways in which First Parish worshipped, not only with more professional musicians, also shorter services.
Now, shorter? You mean no more 5 hours?
No more 5-hour worship services on Sunday.
The topics of the sermons?
The topics of the sermons remain more or less the same. What we see in the 19th century, really, the biggest change that we see in the early part of the 19th century is the beginning of Unitarianism in America, and the Unitarian controversy in the early decades of the 19th century. The Unitarian controversy, of course, was a response to the Great Awakening and
Yeah, well, no, wait a minute. Who's awakening whom?
well, the Great Awakening in the years following the independence of the United States was kind of the evangelical fervor and born-again experiences that were sweeping across the new republic. And Unitarianism was one of the responses to that. Moving away from Calvinist doctrines and away from emotion and fervor in religion and worship. Unitarianism was really a response to that that said that a more rational, a more reasonable approach to religion was what was needed rather than an emotional response. And the theology of that followed in that the Great Awakening was promoting a instantaneous and emotional conversion to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, whereas the more reasonable or liberal what became Unitarian approach was that salvation was a process that one went through over many years. In other words, that one developed one's own character to becoming more Christ-like and to become to live out the ethics of Jesus of Nazareth as a moral teacher. So that was a very different approach to Christian faith.
Now, sinners in the hands of an angry God, that Jonathan Edwards, that's the Great Awakening.
That is the Great Awakening. The idea was really to scare the hell out of people, really, and to make them so afraid of eternal punishment in an afterlife that they would come to Jesus.
And the Great Awakening was characterized by itinerant, untrained preachers, wasn't it? I mean, anybody could sort of...
By and large, anyone could, get the Spirit and start preaching, and did so. As the country expanded westward, that also was, the routes which itinerant preachers would take to, preach the gospel. What many of our churches of the standing order in New England preferred, the ones that became Unitarian, was a more learned approach and a more rational approach to religion. So rather than emotion, really reason was the dominant theme.
And with this parish and its succession of Harvard-trained ministers, the Great Awakening must have been something of a horror.
It was.
I should point out that Peter is the first in our long chain of settled ministers who was not an alumnus of Harvard. We finally broken away from that tradition. Canadian.
Although I'm not an unlearned itinerant preacher by any means.
No. And was the music reflecting this new view of religion?
Yes, well, just the fact that they would go outside of the traditional, the Psalter, go outside of Scripture, and go outside of congregation to have music in the church. That says something there. It wasn't just an experience for the congregation to sing Scripture. They were watching art. They were having art happen in the church. Music as art, not just music as salvation.
Sam, did we get, was the town touched by the Great Awakening with the itinerant preachers wheeling through here?
Not to my knowledge. I've not read anything of that sort, although we are getting several more churches in Lexington in the 19th century, and that begins with the Baptist Church in 1833, who are baptizing their members in a pond down at Vine Brook, near the site of today's police station.
the Baptists had been here before, right? But in 1833, Bill's going to tell us about this. 1833, Massachusetts formally separates church and state, and then the Baptists built a church, right? They had a community, they had a congregation here earlier, right?
And that first church was on the site of the present one, right there on Mass Ave.
But it's not the same one.
No, it burnt in the 1890s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So Bill, what's Bill Smith, member of the History Committee, long serving and here at First Parish. So tell us, aside from music and theology, what's going on around here?
I think the biggest thing that started the 19th century was the death of Jonas Clark in 1805. He'd been a minister here for like 50 years and was like the guiding light. And I guess it was hard to get someone to replace his kind of person. But they had a few ministers after him, and the biggest thing that comes along after that is in 1819, First Parish becomes a Unitarian church, splitting off from the Congregationalists. And it was a pretty popular thing here in church. I guess they'd been led along the way by Jonas Clark. And so that's one thing that came about. And some people who had not wanted to become Unitarians kind of wandered around town, first being with the Baptists, and that didn't settle with them. They moved to the Unitarians, Universalists in East Lexington, where the East Lexington Fire Department is now. And eventually they kind of mixed in with the people at the Second Congregational Society, which is a fallen church. And I think one thing as we see in the 19th century is how Lexington is no longer a one-horse town. It's we've got, like we've mentioned, the Baptists and Universalists, and of course the people down in East Lexington, which was I suppose a quarter of the population of the town at one time, was getting upset because they didn't like to come to church, the 2 miles up the street here, which is called Mass Ave now. So they petitioned to, split off, and that was a controversy.
So was the change from congregational to Unitarian of First Parish, was that a big furor, or did it go pretty smoothly?
It was pretty smoothly. I've heard from different places where they would split off and they hated each other's guts, basically. So it was very, pretty much popular, except like those few people that kind of said, no, we're going someplace else and find our own place, and eventually did down in East Lexington.
Controversy between Unitarians and Trinitarians was actually quite dramatic in many towns, and groups of parishioners would stand and bar the pulpit from certain ministers because they were either too liberal or too orthodox. And there were fights over who got the building and who got the communion silver and all those things. But the one I think that Bill was referring to is the story in Dedham, called the Dedham controversy, in which the two groups did split. The liberal group, the Unitarians, ended up with the building. And then the Trinitarians decided that they would build their building immediately across the street. And so they built it. And so the liberals took their building and turned it 90 degrees so that they wouldn't have to face the other people. So, and you can go into the center of Dedham today and see that those two church buildings are situated in exactly that way, the Trinitarian facing the street and the Unitarian facing their own yard away from the street. So it was more exciting there in terms of drama than in Lexington.
One of the ways that the churches that had been Puritan, in the previous, that had been established by the Puritans, the way in which they went, either liberal, what became Unitarian, and more orthodox, what became Congregationalist, was when they called a minister. And so, there were ministers out there with, Unitarian theological opinions. And so, because our polity is that it's the congregation that calls a minister, that hires a minister, it's the congregation that gets to decide who will serve them as minister. So during the whole Unitarian controversy at the early part of the 19th century, if a congregation was becoming more liberal or more Unitarian in its theology, it would call a Unitarian minister to serve it. So the controversies often arose when a minister needed to be called to serve a congregation, and the question was, are we going to have a more orthodox minister, or are we going to call a Unitarian minister to come serve us? So that was pretty much how it happened. Now, here at First Parish in Lexington, the congregation called a Unitarian to serve as their minister, and that was about it. That was pretty much how the congregation became Unitarian.
And the distinction between Orthodox and liberal in those days was what? What was the difference between them?
Well, despite the names, Unitarian and Trinitarian, the doctrine of the Trinity was not as essential a theological distinctive between the two movements. What it really amounted to was the doctrine of humanity. Were people basically good, or were people basically wicked and depraved? And therefore in the need of a Savior who, died and atoning and sacrificing death for them. On the one hand, there was the view that humankind was capable of bettering itself, of learning to live with, the moral and ethical, living out the moral and ethical principles of Jesus of Nazareth. And on the other hand, a view that people were incapable of saving themselves and needed a supernatural Savior. So really it was about humanity, these two views of humanity. And on the one hand, if you said, well, you don't really need the second person of the Holy Trinity to be, that kind of a Savior, the derogatory term, launched against those people who believed that was Unitarian. Well, you don't even believe that Jesus was the Son of God, and the name kind of stuck as a way of describing this approach to basically a view of humanity, a theology of humanity, a theological anthropology.
Yeah, somebody gave me a copy of the Jefferson Bible for Christmas. And it's a fascinating document, of course, because Jefferson, with a very benevolent view of humankind, literally takes the Bible, the New Testament, and cuts it apart, and keeps the pieces that he thinks are appropriate and fit in with this, glues them into a book, which we have today.
He literally cut and pasted the four Gospels.
Right.
And what he cut is interesting. What literally cut out were the miracles and the kind of supernatural stuff. And what he left in was the moral and ethical teachings of Jesus of Nazareth.
Fascinating. No angels in the Christmas story, no shepherds,
Right.
no wise men, no star.
Right.
Anyway, Bill, I mentioned earlier, this building in which we sit, this comes along in the 1800s, right?
Yes, well, the building that they were at the turn of the century was on the green here, was built in 1795, and I think in 1845 they were going to renovate it, and the place caught fire, burned down. So one important thing that came out of that, when they built this church, they didn't put it on the common because that was public property, and it was this little more separation of church and state. So that's why we're here.
The meeting house always had been on public property.
Yeah.
As we were talking, when we were talking about the 1600s and the 1700s, The meeting house, of course, the original one stood, as we noted, behind where Captain Parker's statue is. But this one wasn't there, the one in the 1800s. It was someplace else on the green.
Yeah, they moved up, I think they moved it closer up to where the monument is here, in that area back, just across the street here.
And it was quite different, wasn't it? It had a steeple.
Yeah.
And it was painted a kind of a pea green. It must have been charming.
Yeah.
And I can't help but note that it had a gilded weathervane. And in Paul Revere's Ride, you remember that Longfellow refers to Revere seeing the gilded weathercock in Lexington. Well, that's wonderful, except obviously on the earlier meeting house, which was on the green at the time of the battle, there was no steeple, there was no gilded weathercock. That's the one that Longfellow saw when he came through here on his way to the Wayside Tavern, but that wasn't the one that was there at the time. So this building was built and paid for. I mean, the old ones were paid for with town funds.
Yeah.
How'd this one get paid for?
Public subscription, I believe, from the people that attend the church, and I guess there were a few donations outside. I think that's basically how it was done. While the church was being built, the congregation met over at the Baptist church.
There were some pretty interesting people in First Parish in those days. Tell us about some of them.
Well, the one that comes to mind most is someone who actually grew up on this corner here, Bedford Street in Harrington, John Augustus, who was a cobbler. He'd been born in Burlington, and he became basically the father of rehabilitation. I guess the first case he did in Boston was try to rehabilitate a man who had been arrested for public drunkenness. And he continued that. That was his life's work, and I've forgotten exactly what the phrase that Theodore Parker said about him, but his life's work was more important than the president and the vice president of the United States. Now, I have no idea who was president when he said that, so. But.
Millard Fillmore, maybe.
Well, yeah.
And so he lived on the corner, and he was a leading member of this church. And you mentioned Theodore Parker. Somehow his name seems to ring a bell.
Yeah, doesn't it, though? Yeah. He was the grandson of Captain John Parker. He was born on the Parker homestead, which is across Route 2 towards Waltham.
On Spring Street.
Spring Street, right. And he grew up in this church, and he attended public school here. And he went on to become a minister. And he was quite a controversial character. Basically, he was shunned by this church because of his views on basically how the religion was running at that time, and also because he was an abolitionist. And he may be most notably known for defending a former slave who was hauled in by the fugitive slave law in Boston, and he actually carried a gun around with him, and he was violently against the slavery, and eventually he joined up with other abolitionists, and they formed this conspiracy that helped John Brown capture the arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. And I guess they met in Concord, and they supplied John Brown with firearms and money, and of course that turned out to be a fiasco. But one wonders whether he thought he was going to fire up something that would kick the whole country open. And And John Brown was the kind of person who was doing that. He was kind of a vicious guy. But so Theodore Parker was not popular here, but he often preached down there at the stone building where the East Lexington Library is. And eventually, after the Harper's Ferry raid, he being a sick man with tuberculosis, left this country and he moved to Florence, Italy, where he was friends with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and he died there, and he's buried there at the English or Protestant cemetery. So is Barrett Browning, by the way.
And his portrait is here in his home church.
Yeah, right downstairs,
Yeah.
right over the fireplace.
Right. Now, with the church and state separation, what happens to those ministerial funds that we were talking about before, that the town funds that supported the pastor of this parish?
Oh, there's a can of worms.
Yeah.
Yeah, the town would give money that would support the First Parish, and there was some controversy about the money that was gained from a wood lot, and so everything seemed to be fine and good if there was only one church. And of course, you get two issues here also of more churches and religions being in town, and also the fact that there was a separation of church and state, and why should the taxpayers be funding a church that they didn't belong to, or any church at all. And that caused a lot of controversy because the Baptists and the Universalists and the people that fallen all wanted part of this stockpile of money. I think it was $16,000 at one point. And eventually the state got tired of supporting this, and I think in 1845 they had a settlement where the ministerial fund was split up between the three churches. I think the Universalists had gone by the boards by then, but it caused a lot of anguish in here. People were upset about it, and I still think there was a problem after 1845. I was reading things about it lasting 100 years, and I find that hard to believe, but I haven't found anything to reference that. It was a big controversy for quite a while.
Peter, you're not paid with the wood lot.
No, I'm no longer paid in wood or chickens or eggs or milk, fortunately.
Abolitionism, Bill mentioned abolitionism, such a burning issue in New England. Well, anything, was Lexington caught up in that fervor?
There were certain Lexingtonians that were extremely involved in the abolitionist movement, such as the Stone Robbins family down in East Lexington. In fact, it has been rumored that the Stone Robbins house, which has since been moved up the avenue to the driveway at Four Seasons in the Monroe District, there are rumors that was a stop on the Underground Railroad. There are also rumors surrounding the Bull House on Hancock Street, that was also a stop on the Underground Railroad. Although for the most part, and of course Bill mentioned the stone building in East Lexington, which was built by that same Stone Robbins family, as being frequented by abolitionist speakers and lecturers. But for the most part, according to an article written by Larry Whipple, the majority of Lexingtonians remained somewhat indifferent at that point.
And what about these liberal Unitarians who now own First Parish? Are they, was there much?
Well, I think, as Sam has said, there was indifference to the question, and I think a certain trepidation about getting publicly involved in abolition, which is why Theodore Parker went to Boston and had a ministry in Boston rather than here. It was, today we like to look back and look at our Unitarian and Universalist heroes and heroines who were, involved with the movement to abolish slavery. But what we don't always remember is the, rank and file, person sitting in the pew was not always entirely sympathetic to the abolitionist movement. So consequently, many ministers, the ministers here would, refer to the questions of the day rather obliquely and wouldn't direct them directly from the pulpit. Not quite, the kind of directness that Jonas Clark, preached about the issues of the day in his time, because it was controversial and because it was not popular among the average church-going person.
So we weren't singing "We Shall Overcome."
No,
No.
no, we weren't.
But there is in the files a record of some kind of controversy. Some group of people left the church at that time, and was that over the failure to address slavery? Or?
I guess there was some kind of undercurrent. Maybe the people that actually were felt for abolitionists here got fervent and said, this place isn't for us. And, I think, like Sam said, I think the people in the East Lexington had a much more interest in abolitionism, and so I'm thinking the Mulligan brothers who were upset about it in this church, and they were very important, and they left and they wrote a lot of stuff which I still don't understand, but so I imagine a few people just left, when they wanted more action, and they went where they could join in or support something.
Was it this time too that the town gave us the clock?
Well, yes, the town paid for the clock to go into this church, although the church was responsible for keeping it running. And I believe there is some record that this was the official town clock as long as it was kept up and properly maintained.
So the church and state separation still has some vestiges of the old relationship.
You could say so.
Yeah. But it is interesting that, as Bill points out, when the 1795 building burned down, 1845-46, the decision was made to move off town land and move to this site. Well, interesting times. Thank you. Now we move ahead to the 1900s and see how this flow continues. It occurs to me as we go through the story that there's something sort of arbitrary about chopping this up into centuries, and we all know that in our own lives and in history, that the flow of history, the flow of people, the flow of ideas doesn't notice that it's the 31st of December and the 1st of January, or that a millennium is passed. So I hope that in watching this story and listening to the story and watching the show, that you recognize that real history and real people don't suddenly change with New Year's Eve. At any rate, we'll now look at the 1900s and what's going on with First Parish in the 1900s. And Elaine Durno comes back to us from her her description of the 1600s and picks the story up three centuries later.
Well, at the very beginning of the 1900s were the last few years of Reverend Carlton Staples being the minister. And he's a really good example of how important First Parish Church and the ministers were to the town. Just by chance, he was walking past the old Clark house as it was about to be demolished. And he was able to talk to the woman who owned it and actually saved it. She wanted it moved out of her sight, and it got put across the street on a little plot of land. But without this chance encounter, we wouldn't have the Hancock Clark house. He also saved the old belfry. He was important to the school committee. He was on the board of the Cary Memorial Library. He preserved town records. And he was involved in the Lexington Fellowship of Charities. I'm not sure what that is. I've never heard of it before, but...
That's interesting because here we have Jonas Clark, as Ellen was telling us, really crucial to the life of the community, the political life of the community, and then Carlton Staples, so critical to the saving of Hancock Clark and the belfry, as you say, development of the Lexington Historical Society. So church and state, but it's changed. Yeah.
In fact, the Historical Society was founded by two principal members, both ministers, Staples of First Parish and Reverend E.G. Porter of the Congregational Church across the Common. So,
Now the Hancock Church.
right.
Right. Good. Okay.
So these are the days of ministers who were not there for 50 years.
Yeah.
More like 20 some odd years. But so Carlton Staples was minister for 23 years. John Mills Wilson was minister 1905 to 22 for 17 years. And he began a lot of fundraising for the church by having fairs, lawn parties, and rummage sales. And this, of course, influenced the community because the church was much more visible by doing these. And he put out a monthly bulletin with the activities in it. He enlarged part of the church, the vestry and supper room, and that thereby the church could be used for more social events. And the Historical Society had its 25th anniversary banquet here in 1911. There were also organizations such as one for young people, the Fraternity of Young People, and two lend-a-hand societies. The next minister was Edwin Slocum, and he was here for 9 years. And now we're getting to the point where there actually were descendants of these ministers. Jean Baxter was the daughter of Edwin Slocum. She was a member for many, many years. And he had a very active young people's group going on, the YPRU, Young People's Religious Union. And at that time, Dana Greeley was in that youth group.
President of the Unitarian Association in Boston at the time of the merger. So First Parish is during these years a focal point for a lot of community activities, right?
Yeah.
the women's group, the men's group, the Alliance was during this time?
The Alliance, I think, was founded just before the turn of the century, in the either late 80s or early 90s. And so it's been in existence for a very long time, and has served as, well, in many ways they've held the church together over the years in terms of fundraising and activities that brought people together. Probably many people in our community know the what's most recently been called the Steeple Shop, which was for many, many years the Clothing Exchange, which was a consignment shop that they ran in the basement of the church, and it benefited everybody in the community. And then the portion of the money that the Alliance took in, they would give to the church, and the Alliance sponsored many important projects. Also, during this time, I don't know when it started, was the Layman's League, which did similar kinds of things. Men gathered for supper, which the women cooked for most of the time, but then they would have a talk. But they also did service projects. And William Roger Greeley, who was a very active member of the church, worked with other people in the church and in the town to build the first affordable housing unit, the Greeley housing unit, up off Bedford Street.
Lots of activities going on here, which are serving the town.
And this next minister, Paul Harmon Chapman, was involved in Cub Scouts, the Florence Crittenden Home for Unwed Mothers, Alcoholics Anonymous, the Rotary Club, the American Legion, the Masonic Order, and Cary Memorial Library. So he was a busy guy.
Echoes of Jonas Clark again.
And then there's Robert Terry Weston, who was only minister for 4 years, who was a poet. Weston's works were published in Unitarian hymn books in the United States and Britain. He resigned as a minister and became a chaplain in the Pacific during World War II. And then we come to Floyd Taylor, 1945 to 1968. These were very, very busy years. The church increased in membership amazingly. There were 2 Sunday services. The children's, the Sunday school classes for children were so big they had to have, 2 of them, I think, or 2 services. The Sunday school was the biggest Sunday school in the whole U.S. There were so
The
many.
one here.
One here.
That's interesting.
Yeah. There were 3 candlelight services.
On Christmas Eve.
Yeah. And it was during his time here that the nursery school was initiated.
So these are busy times, and also the times of World War I and World War II, and all the Vietnam controversy. What did we do about any of those things?
Well, during the Vietnam War, there was a big split in First Parish Church because John Wells was very, very involved in the anti-war movement. And
Some people thought he was more involved in the anti-war movement than he was in the church.
he neglected neglected his duties, a lot of people felt. And when the Vietnam Vets Against the War held a demonstration on the green, they wanted to stay on the green overnight, and the church allowed them to come in and either sleep in the pews or use the bathrooms. And so it was involved in that way, and there were members of the church who were arrested on the green.
So this is a century of a considerable involvement in the community and community activities for the church. And the town is what's cooking in town.
Starting right at the turn of the century in 1900, we get the Minuteman statue right on our front lawn here on the Common. And we get trolley cars, yet another connection into Boston and out to Concord, which results in increased tourist activity. And this is around the time that tourism really becomes a trade in town, with the different historic houses being preserved. As Elaine said, Carlton Staples so involved in saving the Hancock Clark House to be a museum, and the Monroe Tavern and Buckman and the Belfry soon to follow. Meanwhile, we see, looking at agriculture yet again, we see a transition away from that as we go through this century, and by the 1960s, that's really the decade that farms truly leave the town, save for a few here and there that we know today, such as Booza or Wilson. So we've got that change as well. And at the same time, we had talked a lot about East Lexington in the past century, in the 1800s. East Lexington really was the commercial center of the town throughout most of that century, but in the 20th, we see Lexington Center truly become the commercial center of the town for the first time, some might say.
A lot of conflict between Central Village and East Lexington. Had that abated by the 1900s?
When my grandmother was younger, their family actually belonged to the Episcopal Church here in the center, and they'd walk up and down the avenue every Sunday. So there's a bit of a lessening of tensions, one might say, between the two communities, but they do still retain their own community organizations and so forth, such as East Lexington Men's Club and Civic Association for many years down there.
Sam, I moved here in 1949, and I remember the town, 12,500, and you mentioned the farms. It was still fairly rural, and you sure didn't get the traffic that you have now. I went away 1961 to 69, and when I came back, it was a different town. I remember it was really dominated in those, when I first came in, and during the 50s, by Yankees. There were some Irish, there were some Italians, more in East Lexington than in the main part of town. Alan Adams of this church, Ruth Morey of this church, George Nicholson, George Emery. These people kind of ran the town, you know.
Sure.
And then when I came back in 1969, boy, it had changed. What happened?
Well, 1950-51, we have the construction of Route 128 along the western perimeter of the town. And Route 128 gives way for this big boom of different corporations putting their headquarters out here and so forth. Lincoln Labs takes root up near Wood Street. And at the same time, we have a post-war boom of suburbanization in the way of capes, ranches, folks moving out here. Lexington starts to become more of a bedroom community for folks working in Boston, more so than it had been before. And as you say, we get a bit more of a change in ethnicity and culture in the town. Towards the end of the mid to late 20th century, we start to get a lot more Asian families moving to Lexington. And the town's schools, meanwhile, become leaders in the state and the region as far as excellence. And a lot of folks move to town primarily for the education of their children.
Yeah, I think, now, you know, in the 50s, there were very few places that a Jewish family could buy a house. Moon Hill, that development kind of changed that. we became much more ethnically diverse and comfortable with it. You know, I think we moved from one kind of town to another kind of town relatively easily with a limited amount of tension.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what happened? I wonder what happened to the First Parish congregation during this time. Helen was a minister during a lot of that transition. We don't have to go looking at musty old records. She could tell us what was happening.
When I was called in 1980, I was the first woman minister to be called as a settled minister in the church, which actually at the time it was somewhat hard, and there was a serious conversation about whether it was appropriate or not. It was complicated by the fact that the other Unitarian Universalist church in town, Fallon, had a woman minister, so people had serious reservations about it. But the committee that was in charge of looking for candidates did end up recommending me as the candidate to the church, and the candidating week went well, and it ended up, I felt very welcomed and well matched with the church, and that was the opening of a number of more inclusive approaches to the church and ministry that I'm going to describe. I was minister of the church here from 1980 to 2002, which I found to be a very wonderful experience with a very wonderful congregation. Important things were happening in terms of opening up and being much more conscious about being inclusive, such as when we had a significant renovation of the back of the church at the end of the 1980s. We included a good elevator to allow people with handicaps to have access to the church. It was an interesting discussion because, people would say things like, well, why do we need an elevator? Because we don't have anybody in a wheelchair. And we explained, of course, that we don't have people in the wheelchair because we don't have an elevator. So everybody did agree to support the elevator, and that created a much more accessible church. We also improved the hearing system, which we keep working on, but realizing that for people who have hearing problems, we need to provide the tools that they can use. Then a little later, in the 1990s, we became involved in the issues around gay and lesbian relationships. We first went through a process where the congregation educated itself and came to the conclusion that, in fact, they as a congregation wished to welcome services of union for gays and lesbians. At that point, gays and lesbians were not yet allowed by the state to be married, but we did have services of union. So, and then another 6 to 8 years later, we did a full program called the Welcoming Congregation, which meant that we welcome, encourage, nurture, and learn from all people, including gays and lesbians. So I think that's been a major development in the church, being more open, more warm, more interested in learning from our differences and not needing to feel homogeneous. The governance was changed to some extent because it needed clearer lines of who was responsible for what and organizational work.
So active years as the town changes, the church and the congregation's changing, and is the music changing?
Oh yes, well, the first half of the 20th century you wouldn't really have seen much of a difference between the music at First Parish and the music in any other Protestant church in town. It would have been a traditional Christian music that was being heard and performed in this church. And with the Civil Rights Movement, that began to change a bit. The church began to be more somewhat politically active, and there became songs and folk music associated with political movements began to be heard. And that sort of led to the second half of the 20th century. There's sort of duality going on here at First Parish. There's those people who adore the organ and the traditional music they're used to hearing, and there's those people that liked a more secular or popular sound, wanted to have songs less about theological subjects and more about moral subjects, ethics, and things like that. And then, of course, we have the indomitable Francis Judd Cook, who was here in the 60s and is a notable composer who wrote very strange music that's quite beautiful, but odd. He wasn't exactly atonal, but you can't call him tonal either. And his music sort of, it served a purpose. It was progressive, but the themes and the subject matter were traditional.
Well, I'll tell you, steel drums and maracas in this sanctuary, that's a big change.
That is a big change from a church who, at its very beginnings, didn't allow instruments in the church at all, to in the 20th century embracing all different kinds. That was also one of the political and social issues here, was to embrace diversity, and that includes world music being heard in the church.
Yeah, so the town's changing, the parish is changing, and the liturgy and the theology, what's going on there, Peter?
They're also changing and developing. At the early part of the 20th century, as Suzanne has mentioned, we were in many ways indistinguishable from other mainline Protestant congregations in town. What began as what was called the Western controversy, the Western Conference of the Unitarian denomination. Now, at the time, West meant Illinois, so that was the West.
Yeah.
So out in Chicago, there were Unitarians who wanted to drop any reference to Jesus Christ in the bond of union that the denomination had, and that was quite controversial at the time. This was a more humanistic approach to religion that really began with in the late 19th century, when Unitarians who were again from out west, who were very modern in their outlook and approach, who wanted to see Unitarianism move forward past and beyond its Judeo-Christian roots and heritage. And when the denomination continued to affirm the leadership of Jesus, they became frustrated with that, and they formed their own denomination called the Free Religious Association, which eventually, in the early part of the 20th century, petered out as more of those humanistic ideas became accepted by more and more Unitarians in the rest of the country. So we see in the 20th century a real shift from a liberal Christian center of gravity to one that is more humanistic and then more pluralistic. I think as the century ended, as reflected in what's happening in the town and in the music and in our service, that we are also much more pluralistic theologically and spiritually, so that we have streams of liberal Christianity, religious humanism, and other kinds of worldviews that are side by side now.
It's interesting you talk about that. I did a sermon, a service in a church, I think it was in Princeton, some years ago, and I wanted to use a biblical reading, and they didn't have a Bible in the church. I mean, it was sort of a nuisance. And I remember we went through a period here where mentioning the word God, mentioning the name of Jesus, saying anything about Jesus, the scrambled eggs really hit the fan. I mean, it got pretty dicey. And I sense we have really moved through that now. The sanitizing of hymns and we act as tense about all that kind of thing as we were for a few years. Helen, bear me out on that. So it's interesting to hear you talk about evolution and change and movement. And Elena, there were some other things that were town things that were initiated here during that century, huh?
Well, there was,
Particularly the latter part.
there was the Metro program where children were bused in from Roxbury, and it's a very successful program, and evidently it's still going on today.
Oh, it is, and that, I think, Rolly Greeley, Bob and Barbara Kent, some of the people in this church provided a lot of the spark for that.
Also, well, this is the 21st century, but the week-long discussion of death with dignity was open to the whole town, and that really seems like it was a gift to the whole town, that it was well attended.
And the mental health thing that we did before that, the concert series.
Oh, that's right, the free Friday afternoon concert series. And the church is packed for that. It's free and open to the public.
And I suppose that our involvement in Zambia was
Started,
a contribution.
yeah, it started by Al Jacobson. I assume he's really done all this organizing, and people from church have visited Zambia, and people at church have donated generously.
Well, Peter, you've been here now going on 4 years, right?
This is
3 years.
my third year, yeah.
Right, and a glowing time it's been for us. Tell us where this ancient religious community is going. We still carry on our cornerstone the phrase First Parish of Cambridge Farms, 1692, and we're well into our 4th century. Where does First Parish go from here? How is it tied to 1692? How is it looking to the future?
Well, as we've already mentioned, a lot of our shared ministry here at First Parish is geared toward opening our doors and making sure that we are welcoming and inclusive, and also that the values that we espouse here go beyond the walls of this church, and that we can stand for something like having civil dialogue around issues like the death with dignity, ballot question, or inclusion and equality of lesbians and gay men, and that sort of thing. And I think that's the direction that our shared ministry here at First Parish will continue to go in. But what I find astounding and comforting is that in the 21st century, we are very much a product of our history in the way that our congregation is run, which is to say democratically, that we are congregational in polity, that we have no outside authority telling us what to do, That comes really directly from the Puritans and the Puritan form of church governance that continues to this day. And that we don't have a statement of faith that everyone needs to sign on to in order to belong. But what we do have is a covenant, a way that we agree to walk together as a faith community. Again, that's something that comes straight to us from the Puritans. And our entire approach to religion and the religious life being one of direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, as well as our our meeting house and our worship service, all the things that we've inherited from our Protestant Christian heritage. We are all of those things, come to us, directly from our past as first liberal Christian and then transcendentalist. All of those movements continue to inform who we are today. So that when you come to First Parish on a Sunday morning, for example, you see all of those streams of influence continuing in a very lively and living way, which I see, continuing on into the future.
Roots hold me close, wings set me free. I hope you've enjoyed this story of First Parish in Lexington, from the days when First Parish and the town were the same to today, and you picked up a little sense of the continuity, not just of this institution, but of institutions and communities and towns generally. We want to thank Bob and Francine Edwards, who have done the filming for this edition of Lexington Remembers, Mary Gillespie, who's chair of the committee, the talent, as we call it in the TV business, have appeared today. Sam Doran, Elaine Tirano, who got two visits with you, Reverend Peter Bolana, Suzanne Juvenile, our music director at First Parish, Ellen Cohen, the minister emerita, and Charlie Bowen, who did so much for us in gathering documents, and Bill Smith, Charlie Goodell, who put a lot of ideas on the table for us, Marty Caval, who was kind of property manager for the materials that you've seen, the pictures, Ben and Debbie Soul, who worked with Suzanne on the music, and Ann Collins, who put together a lot of the material on the 20th century. So thank everybody who made this show possible. It's been a pleasure preparing it and bringing it to you.